He was both a spendthrift and not very good with money, I suspect, and I think the two are entwined. The family, he's the first Duke of Marlborough, who was 7 or 8 generations earlier, had amassed a huge fortune. Successive generations of Churchills had dissipated it, and most of it, nearly all of it, was gone by the time Churchill himself was born. So there were no great family role models. I have some inkling of how much over the odds he spent from the fact that one of his contemporaries wrote a book about the life of an Edwardian bachelor in London. And he said that you could easily get by on £1,000 a year, which is today's equivalent of £100,000. But Churchill, I could find from his secretary's records in 1905, 1906, spent about £1,400 a year, £140,000, so about 40% over the odds. I think people find them very human. They're amused by them. They can see this man who was, on the face of it, so successful and so good at everything, whether it was painting or writing or making speeches or fighting or leading. He seemed so good, and yet here are these little foibles that make him very human. At its height, I suppose, came in 1921, when he inherited, unexpectedly, as a result of a distant cousin's death in a rail crash. And the same year his mother died, and so money fell in from his father's estate. And he was then worth, briefly, about £100,000, which in today's money is probably £7 million, something like that. 2 wars certainly helped him financially. The first was the Boer War, when he went out as a very highly paid correspondent. And of course he was captured and then he escaped, and that led to a lot of international attention, which he was able to turn into book sales and lecture tours, both in Britain and America. So he ended up, in the aftermath of the Boer War, quite a rich young man in his mid-20s. And then the Second World War was a huge, huge turning point for him. Despite being rescued in 1938, he went into the Second World War, into the position of Prime Minister, with net debt of over £20,000, so the equivalent of over £1 million today. And he had to be rescued, actually. One of the things I found, he had to be rescued soon after becoming Prime Minister in June 1940. But he ended the war with over £100,000, or 3 or 4 million, in his bank current account. Churchill and tax. Well, Churchill hated paying tax. He was reasonably happy to do so until the First World War, because tax rates were much lower. They were about 20% for everybody, direct plus indirect. And so he didn't have to pay very much. But during the First World War, tax rates rose very steeply, and then they stayed there. And they were over 50% for him after the First World War. And the thing is, if you're paid as an author, you get the money in, and then it's not taxed for 2 or 3 years afterwards. And by then he'd spent it. So unless he was doing new projects, he didn't have anything to pay it with. So like many others, he became an aggressive tax avoider, and there was plenty of scope. Well, he was quite a challenge, I suspect, as a bank customer, because he was always breaching his overdraft limits, and he was never sticking to his loan repayment schedules. He was always looking for more. But he had the same bank manager for about 20 years, William Bernau, and I think he really enjoyed looking at. He was a prestigious customer. His whole personality needed risk there the whole time. He was sort of addicted to risk, and the reasons for that are really for psychiatrists to explain rather than me, I think. I spent a long time in his archives, and I looked forward to every day, because you never know quite what's round the corner. He's full of surprises, never dull, and it's always beautifully expressed, usually witty. And he excelled at so many fields, not just as a politician, as a military man, as a painter, as a writer, as a speech maker. And yet he had all these little personal weaknesses, which he quite cheerfully acknowledged. And so he's an endlessly fascinating character. You never know what's around the corner.